Hello, and welcome to our podcast, Skills Headquarters, where we speak about the current trends and practices in HR and talent acquisition. This podcast is brought to you by Zapilio. Zapilio is an AI-powered, data-driven skill assessment platform.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Skills HQ, the podcast that explores the latest HR trends and practices. I'm your host, Vesh, and today we have a very interesting guest joining us. He's an expert in talent acquisition, HR, and employee engagement with strong focus on technology, more recently involved in AI. Please welcome Chanel. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Vesh. I'm happy to be here.
Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been a talent acquisition strategy and operations leader for the last 15 plus years. Currently work for a firm in the cybersecurity space called Trellix, where I'm overseeing TA program systems and learning systems. Prior, I worked with a company called Sprinkler, where I oversaw TA operations and innovation. So systems like implementing things like Greenhouse, later Workday, Eightfold, Honeit, Starred, a number of different technology systems with programs and compliance in other areas as well. More recently, I've been involved in doing an AI project, looking at skills automation. And, when I worked at Sprinkler, it uses generative AI for marketing. So I had a firsthand exposure in seeing, how this technology is evolving, at least in the space of marketing, and how that could be applied to both HR and talent acquisition processes.
So, what would you say has been the most pivotal moment of your career so far?
The most pivotal moment in my career?
Yes.
There have probably been a few, but I would say the most recent one, I would say, is just this pivot to AI and kind of where that's going, and generative AI, because it's becoming embedded in everything that we do. In terms of my career, I've been a RPO leader, a sourcing leader, a TA leader, but I really love the ops space and technology, and kind of where AI is going to help recruiters and augment what recruiters do, and HR as well, I think is really exciting in that direction. It has a lot of opportunities, but there are also some, challenges and pitfalls as well.
Yeah, so AI has been very prevalent in most industries right now. And that's what I was going to ask you. How do you think it is primarily impacting the HR industry?
Well, HR and specifically recruiting, it's going to evolve in a couple of different areas. When I look at, it's going to become embedded in everything that we do, and a lot of technology companies are embedding aspects of AI into their processes and programs as well. When we look at recruiting, I think the initial frontiers are going to be in that sourcing, selection, and assessment level. On the HR side, what we really have to do is look at connecting recruiting and learning systems and look at engagement. And that's going to be done also with leveraging AI, but just in a very different way as well.
Can we talk more about that? What has been your experience in using AI? Could you speak more about your experience at Sprinkler?
Sure. So Sprinkler uses generative AI for customer experience. And so what I look at is how to leverage it for candidate experience. And that's what I'm doing right now, looking at candidate and employee experience and how to leverage AI into that particular process. So when we look at the entire, let's call it the recruiting spectrum, there's different, let's call it impacts to the hiring process, right? As mentioned, as initially, where I think the initial frontiers are going to be, is going to be in that whole sourcing, selection, and assessment levels. And what I'd like to do just really quickly is let me just share a quick slide here. And here it is. And basically what we're doing is we're looking at process and technology infrastructure across the hiring process. So when you plan, source, select, hire, all the way to onboard, deploy, and develop folks, what are some of the technologies there that are leveraging AI that are pretty strong? Paradox AI is a company that Workday acquired, and they have a chatbot called Olivia. It's a really good solution. Eightfold AI leverages AI in terms of ranking candidates against the job description and scoring them for you and doing ATS rediscovery. It's an incredibly sophisticated algorithm that it uses for for, for that part of the process. Zipilio, for example, is also doing a really holistic look at skills and skills assessment, and then looking at how to connect that with jobs. So kind of taking that holistic approach. There are other really interesting vendors in the sourcing, selection, and the assessment space that are coming out. And, Findem is a good one. And Entelo I've used multiple times, and Seekouts is another one. Yeah, for diversity, Seekouts is great. When you start looking at the development and deployment and start looking at more on the employee side, Telology is pretty good as well. I really like what Zipilio is doing. There are other vendors in the space to look at. Skyhive is an interesting vendor out there. Gloat is an interesting vendor because it looks at skills and jobs. So the vendors like that and the companies that do that are specifically in the AI space, I think are going to, are going to leapfrog in that particular sense. Yeah. What I wanted to also share here is this slide here, which basically is looking at AI and breaking a job down into a skill. And when you look at it from a perspective of a recruiter, what are the skills that recruiters need to have from one recruiter to many, right? So you have, they have to be branding experts, sourcers, screeners, assessors, influence, marketing, closing, admins, and analysts. And then when you look at the different skills that can be automated, what I've done on this slide is the plus signs. If there's 3 plus signs, it means it's highly likely that it can be automated. So that assessment can be automated. Screening can be automated more likely. Sourcing can be. We know the administrative process can be. And then when you look at some of the technologies that map to these skills automation, like Paradox, like Eightfold, there's others, Honeit. Some of them I haven't listed here, but there's a lot of really unique vendors that are in the space that are going to impact hiring processes and eventually, impact the recruiting industry as a whole. This, of course, is just the recruiting side. When we start looking at the HR side and looking at assessments, then we're kind of going into a different area as to how the AI can be leveraged. But still, it both require good understanding of AI and how it can benefit the organization.
I feel like there are some concerns about AI replacing human recruiters going around in this industry lately. And what light would you shed on this? Do you envision a balance between AI and human recruiters?
I do. I'll be candid. As AI has been hyped up a lot, there are definite concerns of short-term displacement. I think that's really legitimate because companies are operationalizing AI into their processes, and they're doing it in different ways. So we are going to see. I do. So far, we haven't seen it, but the probabilities of some short-term displacement are feasible. But what I would also say is, if you think about the areas that can't be automated, so AI can you really create an algorithm that mimics human creativity? And the answer is yes, right? You can to a degree, right?
To a degree, exactly.
Like DeepMind, right? The Google investment, right? What it's done is pretty remarkable. What OpenAI is doing with ChatGPT, it has some issues.
Yes.
It has some, unreliability in some areas, but it's strong in a lot of others. So, recruiters can use AI to augment their practices and make their lives easier and be more productive. With that noted, if you think about screening automation and scheduling automation, will that impact a certain number of recruiters across the sphere? Short term, possibly, yeah. But what I would also say is that with the technology, take a look at a company like Adobe and Photoshop. It could have ran away from generative AI, but it jumped into it and it expanded its market share, right? Which meant more jobs, but that took some time. So I think what we'll see is the same thing happening with AI in recruiting and HR. but there will be levels of displacement as we're trying to figure it all out, and new industries and new processes evolve from the AI that we're developing and building, if that makes
Agree.
sense. So,
Yeah. And I feel like if you get into it right, you can really create something beautiful. Like I was so impressed by what Adobe did,
yeah.
and I saw editors doing the process, and it saved them so much time, and that was wonderful. Even with podcasting in my industry, there are now AI extensions that can help us do post production,
Makes
which
sense. Yeah.
again saves our time.
Yeah. And actually, really interestingly, like I live in Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles, you get the news of the writer's strike. I mean, that's not really necessarily national news in the US, but the writer's strike in UI, and one of the big sticking points as to why they're striking is how studios are going to use AI for things like scripts and videos and so forth, right? And I have a couple of friends who are part of who are writers, and we've been talking, and so it's kind of interesting how that community is building some guardrails around AI, or working towards that goal. And I don't know if that's the right solution eventually, but there might be something to that effect within the HR industry that forms certain guardrails
You feel
around.
so? I feel like boundaries in the creative industry are plausible, because I have a friend who has also been directly affected by this writer strike. She works for a VFX company, and I was also thinking about the same thing, and we had this discussion, and I feel like industries that are corporate and not very creative might not jump to strikes.
Oh no, yeah, I agree. They're not going to
Yeah,
do that. They're not going to do that.
yeah,
But I'm speaking more of the framework, so that
yeah.
when you think about the framework of how industries start leveraging and using AI, including recruiting and HR, that's kind of what I was sort of
But
thinking
what do
about
you
more.
feel? What do you feel about the strikes? Like, what is your opinion? Because it is driven by a fear of replacement, right?
Yeah, my view with most technology is embrace it and learn from
Right?
it, and like
Use it for your
recruiters.
own benefit.
Yeah, like if recruiters were using ChatGPT for job descriptions, and generative AI is a great equalizer, right? Like, I mean, I could be, I don't, I have mostly tech company experience. I've got some healthcare, but I've never been a healthcare recruiter. But if I wanted to be a healthcare recruiter, I could learn very quickly using some AI tools, and it could balance me out relative to some recruiters, at least the knowledge base, not the experience, but at least
Yeah,
knowledge I could
knowledge.
learn pretty quickly, right? and
That's
and
true.
so there are things that it can help you with, that I think I think recruiters, instead of running away from it, need to embrace.
Embrace
But
it.
but but
Yeah.
I don't think we can completely ignore, given its
No, yeah.
impact today, like what some of those displacement effects could be. Like that's very legitimate and real, and we hope for certain humanity in our business practices, right? So yeah.
In the end, it's just how the cycles work. A new technology comes, and there is an industry that suffers, and then it just becomes old school, and it will continue. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think the one thing is that AI will, as companies look at, not necessarily radically, but redesigning some of their processes. One of the things I was having a conversation with a recruiter, and we were going to schedule some meetings with some hiring managers to look at some skills gap for early careers, right? And his point is, well, I need to know which jobs, right? And I was thinking about that in relation to this conversation, that in the future, it's not just going to be about what the jobs are, right? It's going to be what the skills are,
Skills
right?
are, yeah.
And how you break down those skills and kind of create that sort of, skills taxonomy, if you will, within each organization, right? And where that moves, and how that evolves, I think, with the skills piece for recruiting. So recruiters, they find talent, but maybe in the future they're also finding skills. And I don't know what the delivery maybe it's like Zapilio or another
Exactly.
provider that
That's what I
has the
was gonna
basic
say.
folks, right? And
Yeah.
then you map them to the jobs, or where they can do the skills. Or I have been thinking that some of those gig platform providers, like the Upworks of the world, like that's going to grow. It is growing, and it's going
It
to
is. It
continue to
is.
grow as
We're
you.
stepping more into the gig industry.
Yeah. Well, but
Yeah.
if you're only looking to acquire a certain set of skills, or you only need X percentage of these skills within your organization after you've done some analysis, then and it doesn't have to be all of it confidential. Then you can leverage some of these types of platforms. So recruiting or talent acquisition and HR can evolve to not just acquiring talent, but maybe acquiring skills, whatever that delivery mechanism, and that's going to keep evolving, right? Because it's
Yes,
multiple
I
delivery
agree.
mechanisms today, right?
Yeah.
So
That's exactly what Zapilio is trying to do, right? The method that we're using is more assessment based, where if a said candidate is claiming to be an expert in a particular skill, they have to take assessments, and then they will be scored based on those assessments, and then
yeah,
the reports will immediately be shared with recruiters.
yeah. But what you really need is a connection and an integration with a recruiting system, and then if you can map that to then of course your HR system as well, and then you
Yeah.
have it holistically, right? And you
Yes.
you can see the skills gap. Then you can kind of figure out what skills you need to acquire and what talent you need to acquire, and that's the hybrid that over the next 5 to 10 years could be the evolution of how it looks.
Yeah.
So.
Which side do you lean towards? Are you more for skill-based hiring, or are you more for the traditional form of hiring?
I would say for me, it's an evolution, and you just have to like adapt to the evolution. So it's not per se that it has to be a jobs-based function or just a skills-based function. I see it as a hybrid, but I see the advantage of moving to more of a skills-based type of organization and taking a very holistic view of that. And having that skills ecosystem, right? And having those coalesce. And I think, companies like Zapilio are going to help, further that along. So, yeah.
So, what do you think are the potential challenges or limitations of relying heavily on AI in the recruitment process? Since we're talking about it, what do you feel like are some skills and competences that HR professionals should focus on developing to largely understand AI and enhance, say, employee engagement or fairly treating all the candidates?
Yeah, so I think the first part of your question is what are some of the issues or challenges or that can occur, right, with it? And I think it's still evolving. So there's, Chat GPT has, unreliability in parts, right? There's risk of misinformation. There's risk of social manipulation, right? Like, I mean, so, are you really talking to the right are you talking to the right engineer with the skills
Yes,
that you think you're talking to,
they
right?
have. Yeah.
So I think, I mean, there are ways of vetting that, of course, but I do think that, some of, unreliability, it's evolution because, the algorithm learns, right? It's self-learning and and it has to keep learning. And, computers don't have egos when they make mistakes. They learn from them, right? So they can keep evolving, right? And so I think that's going to be a factor. For HR, when we think about competencies and the type of skills they need to adopt, AI into their world, I think the first thing I'll say is that I think if you're a head of HR or a head of recruiting, you really do need to look at this because your organization is going to become much more agile, competitive, and skilled if you do embrace AI. So I think Brene Brown, right, great writer. You can choose courage or comfort, but you can't choose both, right? And I think companies and HR departments are gonna, at some point, they're gonna have different degrees to how they embrace it, but they are going to have to embrace it, right? And adopt it into their processes. So I think the sooner, I think certain skills that are important. Maybe this is a little biased, but operationalizing skills like HR teams need to operationalize this technology and create the right integrations. I find in HR technical integrations, like integrating your recruiting and your learning system, it takes some investment, and not all companies have those competencies to do that. Yeah, but the long-term value of making those integrations and that initial investment is going to pay off. It's one of the analysis that I've done at my current organization is looking at what our capacity and costs are, and looking at if we leverage technology and AI, how much more productive we are going to be. And that, once you look at the business cases, business leaders and HR and recruiting leaders are going to have to make decisions as to the direction they want to go. So, change management skills, definitely. Taking people along, because there's going to be fear involved in this for some roles and professions, right? Like when we look at employee engagement, the evolution of intelligent virtual agents and chatbots that help with employee engagement. Like companies like ServiceNow and others, Workday does an amazing job of it as well, right? Where you have a library of those questions and answers, and you have chatbot functionality. That chatbot functionality can resolve probably over half, 50 to 60% of most employee inquiries, right? So that technology is going to impact HR in different ways, right? And so, Cyber Ninja is a really interesting executive assistant chatbot, right? Then there's others. And so when we look at those tools, right? Adopting those tools. So, change management, skills, tools adoption. Those are some of the competencies that organizations are going to need to explore. So I'm probably missing 100 others, but so, yeah.
I'm sure there are more. So let's speak more about employee engagement. What would you, how would you recommend that, since it is such a critical aspect of every organization, how do you think organizations that are considering implementing AI in their recruiting process can exactly help escalate employee engagement further?
I think HR organizations are going to really have to look at a redesign of corporate processes. And that's going to create new value creation within the organization. That's going to create new opportunities. That's going to create the new roles. That's going to create, opportunities for people to go from one area to another. And of course, reskilling is going to be important within that process as well. Yeah. But when we look at employee engagement, it goes beyond looking at the moments that matter. It's looking at how to engage an employee throughout their life cycle and tenure as an employee. But I would also add, even when they start as a candidate. So you tie in the candidate and employee experience, and you have a wealth of data and insights about, where you're sourcing from and how you're developing people. So I think like tying those together are incredibly important. And when we look at employee engagement, when you look at the capacity of just say a chatbot, I have 20 questions. I can just ask it immediately and get it resolved, right? That is a huge differentiator than the way most current HR organizations are functioning today, right? That is going to be huge value creation. When you have that type of technology integrated into your HR operations or HRIS type of function, however it's managed within, respective organizations. But yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. I feel like organizations that can afford one really should invest in a career architecture. Because I
Like a
have,
skills architecture, right?
yeah, like a skills
Yeah, I
architect
agree.
who is in touch with every candidate and is looking, engaging with them on like monthly basis about their personal career.
But you can have a career agent that does that. Eightfold, it identifies skills and adjacent skills, right?
Yeah,
With its AI, right?
yeah,
So
and
yeah.
understands which individual would be great at a job if they reskilled him for a
Exactly.
certain role. Yeah, that would
Yeah.
be
I,
brilliant.
I would just say one thing that, organizations and HR organizations, they don't have to be startups, but but that startup mindset helps as you adopt AI. Like, ChatGPT with OpenAI, right? I mean, Microsoft did beat out Google, but it maintained a very startup mentality to be able to do that. So when you kind of, work backwards again on redesigning some of those corporate processes where you can integrate a job and a skill, it's a brave new world. I mean, that's truly brave new world, right? So.
What advice would you give to organizations that are considering implementing AI in their recruitment processes right now?
The advice I would give is, like earlier, embrace it, right? But learn from it. There is hyper locality. Every company and location is different and is unique. And we just have to understand that. But what I would say is that, areas like sourcing, screening, assessment, there are going to be more automation solutions around that. So recruiters embrace it by learning, some of those technologies and solutions. But where is the creativity within the recruiting and HR processes, right? Where the algorithm cannot, mimic that creativity, right? That human level creativity, and the influencing, how to market, the advisory elements, right? Double or triple down on those and build those skill sets, and then use AI to help with the other areas that it can automate. I think that's what's going to make a real big impact for the recruiting and HR space. And it's easy to say don't be fearful of it. I think that's it's a bit of a cliche, right? Because it is legitimate. It's AI. I've been in. I am dating myself, but I've been in the HR space for quite a while, right? And I've seen a lot, and I've heard, oh, this technology is going to replace recruiters or this, and it never comes to be, and it shouldn't, because recruiters add huge value. Recruiters and HR professionals add huge value. But what I do think is that with AI and generative AI, it is different this time, and how we adapt to it is going to, really affect its effect within the organization and our own personal careers, right? So.
I agree. Yes. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to add, or any resources that you would like to recommend for our listeners that work in the HR industry?
I think, Zappilio has some great resources on his website. It's a great place to go for that. Talent Tech Labs is a great resource just to know what the tech landscape is and where AI is evolving. So, if you're looking for a particular type of chat function, maybe a company like Organize or Gloat might be able to be the right provider, or others, right? So you just, I think those are two really good resources as well. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Chanel, for joining us today and sharing amazing insights on employee engagement and the role of AI in recruitment. It was such a thought provoking discussion, and I really had fun chatting with you.
I did too. Thank you, Aish.
To our listeners, thank you so much for tuning into Skills HQ. We'll come to you with future episodes every week, and until then, keep honing your skills at the HR headquarters. Take care.
Thank you for staying until the end. If you liked our conversation, go ahead and follow Zappilio on LinkedIn for more such content.